Welcome to the newest episode of Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. I'm your host, Jason Fraley, picking the brains of the top filmmakers, musicians, and artists of our time. Jim Lampley hosts a special live chat on ppv.com this Saturday night for the big boxing match between Canelo Alvarez and Jermell Charlo. He joined me to preview the fight and discuss his prolific broadcasting career, including his signature calls the night that Buster Douglas upset an undefeated Mike Tyson, and the night that George Foreman became the oldest heavyweight champion ever, regaining the title he lost to Muhammad Ali 20 years earlier. Hey, Jim Lampley. Hey, thank you so much for joining us on WTOP in Washington, D.C.
My privilege, Jason. How are you?
Legend of sports broadcasting, particularly boxing. And of course, we got to tell everyone we're talking because you're going to be hosting a really special live streaming, live chat function there on ppv.com Saturday, September 30th in Vegas for the big fight between Canelo Alvarez, who's the super middleweight undisputed champ, and Jermell Charlo, who's super welterweight undisputed champ. I guess let's start there. I mean, there's so much I want to ask you about your career, but let's start with this big fight. Give me the tale of the tape, the keys to this fight.
Well, tale of the tape is indeed a material subject because it is in some ways a weight equation fight. In Canelo, you have a fighter who has functioned all the way up to 175 pounds from his origins way back in the day as a 135-pound lightweight. And he's coming back down to 168 pounds, almost certainly a better weight for him than 175, the weight at which he lost to light heavyweight champion Dimitri Bivol. So he's looking to reestablish himself as certainly the number one monetary and commercial attraction in the sport, the number one fighter dollar for dollar. He would like, if possible, to get back to number one pound for pound one more time before the seemingly encroaching end of his career. And so he's taking on an opponent who might mount a very significant challenge for him, and that's Jermell Charlo, who's coming up 14 pounds to get to 168 pounds, and therefore giving an advantage to Canelo going into the fight in terms of weight, but who may be quicker, who may be able to step inside of Canelo's jab and power punches and land some damaging punches on the inside if he's brave enough and willing enough to do that, who is a live enough underdog that it wouldn't be a beyond understanding shock if Jermell were able to win the fight and therefore put him in position to seek the mythical pound for pound supremacy spot that used to belong to Canelo, that now belongs to Terence Crawford. And Jermell is in the general weight neighborhood where he could seek a Terence Crawford fight if he were to win it, just as Canelo could consider the possibility of a Terence Crawford fight if he were to win it.
Awesome. Thanks for breaking that down. And I'm glad that you mentioned, the going up and down in weight classes and stuff because, well, boxing fans know this, but if our listeners don't, Jermell Charlo has an identical twin, Jermall, and everyone thought, his big bro would be the one to fight Alvarez, more pound for pound, equality there. But a lot of boxing fans were surprised that little bro got the match. Were you surprised that too?
Not totally surprised because, Canelo is looking to fight people he can beat.
Yeah.
And Jermall is seen as the larger of the two Charlos. So Canelo may think that he has a more functional weight advantage against little brother than he does against big brother, but they're identical twins. How different can they possibly be? Oftentimes, the weight at which you're fighting is the product of the business opportunities that face you and not the product of where you really belong on the weight scale at that moment in time. And you need no further evidence of that than to sit back and wonder, why in the world did Canelo Alvarez choose to fight Dimitri Bivol, who was a full-fledged light heavyweight, who was quite arguably the best light heavyweight in the world at that time, who was not the kind of battered and somewhat used Hulk that Sergey Kovalev was at the moment when Canelo enhanced his reputation by going up to 175 and beating Kovalev 4 years ago. So it's a mystery to me by what process Canelo came to the conclusion, oh, I really want to fight Dimitri Bivol. Bivol didn't have a huge Western world audience. Bivol does not have an electric personality, but he was a longer and logically stronger fighter than Canelo in the ring, with superb skills that have been developed all the way through an extremely successful amateur and professional career. So to me, that was a matchmaking error. The people in Canelo's world may argue with me, and they may find a way to do so next week in Las Vegas about why it was a good idea from a matchmaking standpoint, but I don't think it was. And of course, the fallout from it is that Canelo gets a loss that takes him out of consideration at this moment for number one pound for pound, and gives Crawford the leverage of being number one pound for pound if they happen to try to negotiate a meeting after a potential Canelo win in this fight.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's great points you're making, and I just thought the twin brother angle with the with the Charlo brothers, it's that interests me because I'm a twin myself, not identical fraternal.
Oh, really?
But yeah. But that always interests me, or when there's brothers like the Klitschko's, and I always think it's an interesting angle there to cover. I'm sure. Well, that I mentioned I grew up a twin, but I want to tell everyone your origin story. You were born in North Carolina, in '49. And did I read that your dad died when you were just 5 or something? So was sports like an outlet for you? Did you have sports heroes growing up that were, I don't want to say father figures, but you know what I mean, that you idolized, and that was kind of helped you, heal with it?
I'm a storyteller, descended from storytellers. My mother was an inveterate storyteller, and my grandmother, who lived to be 102, stood in her kitchen and told stories over and over and over all of her life. So I'm conditioned by my background to be both a listener to stories and a reciter of stories. My wife likes to point out, about 75% of your stories, Jim, begin with the words, my father died when I was 5 years old. So my father died when I was 5 years old. And I'm living with my mother, my father's only son, along with an older half brother whose father was also dead. My mother, the double widow, now locked into Hendersonville, North Carolina, which was not her hometown. It was my father's hometown. And I've often told the story, and I'll tell it again for you, of the moment in 1955 when my mother took me to a neighborhood cocktail party with adults and walked me down the hall to a guest bedroom and installed me on a chair in front of a tiny television set that was mounted on a TV dinner tray, and said, sit right here. You're going to watch a boxing match. The boxing match is on Gillette Friday Night Fights. The fighters are Sugar Ray Robinson fighting against Bobo Olson. It's for the middleweight championship of the world, and it's their second fight. And in the next hour and a half, a man named Don Dunphy is going to tell you everything you need to know about boxing. Now, part of it was because, as she said, if your father was still alive, this is what you would be doing, and he would be doing it with you. It was also because my mother developed passions for certain sports stars, and Sugar Ray Robinson was one of them. If you ever saw Sugar Ray Robinson fight, you might understand why women fans would have flocked to him the way they did. They did fight twice, and I know for a fact that the one I watched was their second fight, Robinson-Olson 2.
So Robinson knocked out Bubba Olson first in the first fight. Right. That was right before him and LaMotta's final Sugar Ray Robinson, Jake LaMotta, Raging Bull match that Scorsese did later, right? And then you would have caught Bubba Olson, Robinson 2. Okay, all right.
Which was a decision win for Robinson, right?
Yep. You're right. Your memory is golden. Oh, that's awesome.
Good. So I sat and I watched the prize fight. I watched Sugar Ray Robinson beat Bobo Olson. That began a many-year stretch of watching Friday night fights on Gillette. And the outcropping of that many years later has been in 1987 when I was assigned at ABC Sports to do blow-by-blow on boxing matches, people would ask me, how are you going to succeed Howard Cosell? What's it going to be like to be the next voice following Howard Cosell? And I said, Cosell's not the voice in my head. I spent my childhood listening to Don Dunphy calling fights. And to this day, if I do blow by blow on a fight, as I did for 30 plus years, the voice in my head as the sort of governing example for how you call a fight was Don Dunphy. Economical, precise, factual, to the point, not self-aggrandizing, making the best use of words that he possibly could in calling the fight. He was the best. I listened to him and inculcated as a child the way that he did it. And my mother continued to guide me through sports. She sat me down and made me watch the 1960 Rome Olympics because she knew there was an athlete there that I would be interested in, and his name was Cassius Clay. We eventually moved from Hendersonville, North Carolina to Miami. The very first live prize fight I ever attended, with lawn mowing and car washing money for a ticket, the price of which I can't remember, and I wish I could, was Sonny Liston versus Cassius Clay, February 25, 1964, for the heavyweight championship of the world. The fight which was what was at that moment seen as the biggest upset in the history of boxing. 26 years later, in Tokyo, on February 11, 1990, I would wind up calling the fight that succeeded that fight as the biggest upset in the history of boxing, the night that Buster Douglas knocked out Mike Tyson. So if you're a believer in destiny, if you're a believer in, certain scripts are written out in advance, my evolution as a boxing blow-by-blow person is one of those examples. I could not resist sitting there in Tokyo at ringside thinking, wow, the very first prize fight I ever saw live was the biggest upset in the history of boxing. And now I'm sitting here narrating for the American audience the fight which will succeed it as the biggest upset in the history of boxing.
Oh, yeah. Buster Douglas upsetting Mike Tyson is arguably the most not just boxing, but maybe the biggest upset in sports history. We'll remember him, grabbing for his mouthpiece, barely conscious, still trying to put it back in his mouth.
Great television camera shots of Tyson trying to scrape the mouthpiece across the canvas so that he could pick it up with the glove, not an easy thing to do, and get it back into his mouth.
Oh yeah, it was insane. I'll circle back to Tyson later. There's so many big fights I want to talk to you about. But I'm gonna but before we even get to that, I want to sort of somewhat try to go a little chronologically. What was your big break then to break into the biz then? Like, because I know you graduated UNC in Chapel Hill in '71, and was you starting to get your master's, but then ABC offered you a chance to go cover a bunch of different sports. Was that the big, first foray into the biz?
Well, you've done terrific research. That's 100% correct. I was in a master's degree program in the radio, television, motion pictures department here at UNC after having gotten my degree in English in 1971. Within my extracurricular activities in that master's degree program, I began doing some work for University of North Carolina football and basketball radio broadcasts. I was doing the Bill Dooley pregame and postgame show on the football network. I was doing the Dean Smith show and other basketball related shows on the basketball network. In 1974, while I was still trying to finish my master's degree studies in the radio television department, ABC Sports came up with the somewhat gimmicky idea of putting a college age or close to college age announcer on the sideline of the college football telecast. It was a new expansion of coverage. I could go on about this. The whole history of sports television is a territorial invasion. Television is constantly trying to expand its invasion and its imprint into the physical space of sports events. And I was 25 years old and had been hired out of graduate school at the University of North Carolina out of a 432-person talent hunt by ABC. I'm the first person who ever stood on the sidelines of a football game with a camera and a microphone. Nobody had ever done that.
Crazy.
And I wound up spending 3 years on the sideline, and I pioneered the whole experience of the sideline reporter. It was actually an innovation that proceeded from technological evolution. It was something that happened because ABC had learned at the Munich massacre in 1972 during the captivity of the Israeli athletes, with Howard Cosell and Peter Jennings pushing them to get closer to the story. They had learned that radio frequency, wireless, cameras and microphones would do things they didn't think they would do. The signals would jump over metal barriers or go around walls and stuff like that. And so they came back from Munich and had a meeting among the sports and news and engineering divisions. What is it we can do with this knowledge now that we have it? And the first thing that came out of it was we could put a reporter on the sidelines of a football game. And they knew they couldn't get the NFL to buy into it right away, but via an advertising agency in New York that had the Chevrolet account and the amount of money that Chevrolet spent on college football, they basically owned college football. They could get college football to do what they wanted to do. So that's how I got a network television job, was to go onto the sidelines of college football in 1974. And it was supposed to be for 1 year. And I wound up having to do it for 3 years because I was good at it. And I got so sick of it, and I wanted to be off the sidelines. And I realized that this would be the ideal vehicle for putting women on the telecast. We were already noted for showing shots of pretty women in the stands and cheerleaders on the college football telecast. Why not use this to put women on the sidelines as sideline reporters? And I went to management and suggested that. And that's the reason why every female reporter you see now on the sidelines is there, because I said to them, this is the right vehicle for integrating the gender scene in sports commentary.
You pioneered the sideline reporter. That's amazing.
I was the first. So that was my first network television job. And then I wound up getting assigned to all the events that every other veteran broadcaster at ABC Sports had already covered several times. The gimmicky events on ABC's Wide World of Sports, the wrist wrestling, the log jumping, the New York State Firemen's Competition,
right.
The barrel jumping, I should say, the log rolling, etc. I did all of those events 3, 4, 5 times. Everybody else, McKay, Gifford, Bill Fleming, eventually Al Michaels, they all did those things once. I was the guinea pig who had to go and do everything 4 or 5 or 6 times.
You're paying your dues. You're paying your dues.
I did. And I fought my way up.
Tell me about football really quick. I mean, I know you did the USFL for a while with early Steve Young and Jim Kelly and Reggie White and Herschel Walker, but right. I want you to tell me about that Super Bowl in early '85. You and Al Michaels doing the pregame and postgame. God, I think O.J. Simpson might have been there too. Man, crazy in hindsight. But tell me about getting to hand the Lombardi Trophy after the game, and man, it was Niners and Dolphins. But it's Joe Montana versus Dan Marino, Bill Walsh versus
it was Dan Marino
Shula.
And Joe Montana. It was a memorable Super Bowl in Palo Alto, and it was my first crack at hosting the pregame, the halftime, the wraparound of the Super Bowl. So that was very exciting. And I had met Bill Walsh a few years before he went to the 49ers, and I had some conversations with Walsh, and at that moment in time, there was no one who could teach you more analytically about football. He brought a Stanford team when he was coaching at Stanford down to Arizona State, and we had a meeting with Walsh and his staff the day before that game. That was probably 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years before that Super Bowl. I was doing college football play-by-play at ABC. That was probably the second or third regional game that day. And he sat in a meeting the day before the game and said, we're going to do something new. I'm not sure that anybody has done it before, but we are committed to this. We really think that this is going to work. And what it is that I have scripted the first 30 plays from scrimmage, and we are going to run the first 30 plays from scrimmage in sequence, the way they've been scripted and the way we have rehearsed them in practice, and we're going to do it regardless of down and distance.
Whoa.
I said, you mean if you throw an incomplete pass on first down and it's 2nd and 10, and the next play in the list is an off tackle play, that's what you're going to do? He said, exactly.
Oh
we
my
have
gosh.
we've rehearsed them in sequence in practice. We have gotten the players mentally focused and ready to run these plays exactly in the order in which we want them to take place, and we believe it's going to work. I believe when the rehearsed plays were finished, they were up 17-0 or something like that. It was they jumped out to a lead which they never surrendered, and he never stopped scripting plays. He would do that some for every game. I remember one time I asked him, what do you think is the most decisive factor in playoff football? What's the single biggest thing that wins playoff games for you? Expecting him to talk to me about the virtues of having the great quarterback, having the quarterback who can produce the big play at any moment. And he said, Jim, the most important competitive play in National Football League football is, can you sack the opposing quarterback late in the game? If you can sack the opposing quarterback in the fourth quarter, that is the most demoralizing thing you can do to the opposing team. And I said, give me an example. He said, I'll give you the perfect example. We had Joe Montana for quite a while before we won Super Bowls. Then we got Charlie Haley. We won 4 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
And he was beyond compare in terms of thinking and analyzing what it was that really worked in football. And I remember learning so much from him just in those small exposures to him.
Wow, Bill Walsh, man, a legend.
Yeah.
I want to remind our listeners, you covered 14 different Olympics. Crazy.
Correct.
Is there one, that stands out the most? I know you were there for the Dream Team with Jordan and Bird and Magic, all those guys at the 92 Summer Games in Barcelona. Yes. You were there for, the horrific terrorist bombing at the 96 games in Atlanta, but also Kerry Strug sticking that landing on one leg. There were positive moments from that too. Michael Phelps winning a record 8 golds at Beijing in 2008. Like, is one of those the most standout, or something I didn't even mention?
The Phelps first burst at Athens, and I was the person who was chosen to do the most touching and meaningful interview, which was the interview with his mother after all the competition was over, with the two of them together, where he described what he owed to her for all of the hours of her life, all the effort she put into getting up every morning, driving him an hour and 15 minutes away to go to swim practice, taking him back to go to school, getting him from school, taking him back for afternoon practice, driving him back, etc. He was very deeply in touch with how much he owed to his mother for having become who he was, and I had the privilege of sharing that with them in the wrap-up interview at Athens in 2004. But by far my biggest Olympic memory, and it's interesting, it wasn't my event, it was Al's event. But in Lake Placid, my original assignment was to cover all of the organizational snafus and political difficulties that were going on at the Lake Placid Olympic Games. People mired in parking lots waiting for hours for buses that didn't show up, tickets that people bought that never arrived, et cetera. There were overwhelming organizational problems in Lake Placid. And also at the same time, there was this overarching political darkness, because the American Olympic Committee was lobbying the International Olympic Committee to try to move, delay, or cancel the Moscow Games because there were Russian tanks in Afghanistan. Sound familiar? That we wound up boycotting an Olympics because of Russian tanks in Afghanistan, only to wind up ourselves mired in Afghanistan decades later. But at any rate, that was my beat at Lake Placid, was all that political stuff. and the organizational problems. And I was in an edit bay on the Friday night of the second week of those games, sitting with a producer and a tape editor, and we were putting together a compendium piece for the closing ceremony show on all the things that I had done during those Olympics. And as we were sitting there doing all that, we had a tiny monitor on the upper left corner at the edit bay, and in the monitor, we're watching the United States play the Soviet Union in hockey. Now, this is a key point. It's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Millions of American television fans and viewers believed they watched the hockey game live. They didn't. They saw it on tape because it took place at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The United States and ABC both tried very hard to get the game moved to 8 p.m. for prime time, but the Russians wouldn't do it. And the Olympic Committee held firm and said, no, it's always been on the schedule at 5. We're going to play the game at 5. So at the end of the first period, Mark Johnson, a little kid who had been the hottest goal scorer in the world for 2 weeks, shoved the puck under Vladislav Tretiak's glove just as the buzzer sounded to end the first period, and the score was suddenly tied 2-2. And moments later, the red phone began blinking in our edit bay. Now, the red phone was an ABC Sports institution. At that time, every facility, every office, every production truck, every single place in anywhere related to ABC Sports had a red phone. And the red phone was the Rune Arledge phone. The only way that phone would ever ring was that Arledge was calling you. And we're sitting there, it's 2-2, we're between periods, and suddenly the red phone is blinking in our edit bay. I had been at ABC Sports 6 years. I had never seen a red phone blink. The producer looked at me, the tape editor looked at me, and they both gestured as if to say, you're the man, you're the senior, you're the person who has to get it, pick it up. So I picked up the phone, and it was his voice. Is Jim Lampley there? Yes, Rune, this is me. What are you doing? I told him what I was doing. He said, drop that. We can pick that up later. We'll figure it out. Something weird is going to happen at the hockey arena. I can feel it. I need you to go over there, get in, and make sure that you can find us somebody to interview when that game is over. We'll save 7 or 8 minutes after the primetime presentation for you to get a throw from McKay and interview somebody, because I just have this crazy feeling that something's going to happen in the hockey game. Well, of course, we all know what happened in the hockey game.
You believe in miracles.
Yeah, exactly right. All I can say is I went into the arena, even with the wrong credential. I got Mike Ruzioni and Jimmy Craig. We stood on Main Street in Lake Placid that night at 11:53, getting ready to go off the air. 10,000 people gathered in the street behind us. Just before McKay threw to me, Ruzioni, who's quick-witted and smart, turned to me and said, Lamps, if we had stood here last night in this same position, I said, nobody would have noticed. He said, exactly. And
wow.
That's my favorite Olympic memory, of course.
Absolutely.
And by the time Rune Arledge was finally removed by new ownership from the presidency of the sports division in 1987, we had a new incoming division president who came from another division at ABC. And his one overwhelming prevailing attitude toward the sports division was, who is Jim Lampley? Why are we paying him all this money? And how do I get rid of him? So he was looking for a way to make me walk away from my contract. And he assigned me to boxing, thinking, okay, this is a preppy kid from a college campus who got all sorts of privileges here. There's no way that he will fit with or understand the boxing culture, and there's no way the boxing culture will take to him. So if I assign him to ringside commentary in boxing, this will kill him. Of course, he knew nothing about my background. He didn't know that the first sports event I ever watched on television was Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson. And he also wasn't paying much attention to the fact that the network had signed an entry-level sort of look-see contract with a 19-year-old heavyweight from upstate New York, whose name was Mike Tyson. So my first ringside boxing commentary at ABC Sports was covering Tyson's first several network television exposures when he was getting to the end of the introductory violent knockout streak that gradually moved into more competitive fights. And I was watching that transformation take place. And then eventually I did walk away from my contract at ABC Sports because it made no sense to keep working for a division chieftain who really hated me and wanted me gone. And I signed a contract to go to Los Angeles and work for CBS. And almost immediately, HBO, which had taken Tyson away from commercial network television and was now making him the centerpiece of their premium pay cable boxing telecast, reached out and said, "We want you to call our fights." So I moved to HBO in terms of boxing commentary in 1988, and therefore wound up with 30 years as the blow-by-blow commentator for the most prestigious, most honored signature boxing telecast in the history of boxing television. And no greater privilege could ever have come to me than to cover the fighters and the fights who were on HBO at that time, beginning pretty early on with Tyson Douglas and everything that followed it.
Oh, you are. I am getting goosebumps because your voice and that whole HBO team was like the soundtrack of my youth and then middle
Good.
school, high school, all of those fights. Man, I loved it. And you mentioned Douglas upsetting Tyson. When that happens, like obviously. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. Some of the great calls in sports history. Al Michaels. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. I mean, maybe he had a few seconds to think about it as the clock's ticking down. But something like a punch to jaw, knocking Tyson out. Like you don't have time to come up with a signature call. Are you just going from the heart?
I have a tremendous longtime friendship, which I developed shortly after I moved from New York to Los Angeles with the greatest actor of my generation, Jack Nicholson. Oh. And a long, long time ago, Nicholson, early on in our friendship, said something to me that I never, ever forgot. And he said, regardless of whether you're acting, you're broadcasting, whatever kind of public performance you're involved in, the first rule for success is don't overact. When Douglas knocked Tyson to the canvas, and it was abundantly clear to me that Tyson was not going to get up, the voice in my head was Jack Nicholson, don't overact. And so therefore, the call, if you go back and listen, is Mike Tyson has been knocked out. Simple, prosaic, straight to the point, no attempt to embellish whatsoever. The next time I ran into an occasion where I thought I might have wanted to have an Al Michaels, Do You Believe in Miracles, was the night that George Foreman knocked out Michael Moorer to become the oldest heavyweight champion in history.
This is 1994?
November 5, 1994. And George had been my expert commentator on the HBO telecast for quite a while at that point. And I had called the fight in which Moorer had beaten Holyfield to win the heavyweight championship. And there were several occasions leading up to that night. Really, and trust me, I didn't believe George had a chance. There were several occasions leading up to that night when at the pre-fight meal or sitting around the production meeting table or walking down a hallway somewhere, I would say to George, how are you going to beat Moorer? He's a southpaw. He's a mover. He has much better feet than you have.
He's 19 years younger.
Exactly. He's a 26-year-old unbeaten heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
How in the world are you going to beat this guy? Holyfield couldn't find him, and Holyfield's a much better mover than you. And every time I asked George that question, I promised you, probably a half dozen times, George would look at me with a very calm stare and say, Jim, you watch. There will come a moment late in the fight when he will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Now listen to the words. He will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Go back and look at the video. It's uncanny. It's off the board. How did he know that he could make that happen? So I'm sitting there thinking, why didn't I stay up late last night in my room and dream up a line for this? Why was I so dismissive of George's chances to do this? And what reflexively came out of my mouth was, it happened. It happened. Best
So
call of
that
my
line is referring to, you're saying, wow, what he told me happened. I mean, it's
what no
boxing lore
viewer could
now, but
know.
you're referring to that conversation you had with him. It happened.
100%. No viewer could have known what that line meant. No,
Wow.
I don't even think there were people on the production crew who knew what that line meant. I had kept it between me and George. I didn't want to embarrass him. And now there it is in front of me. So reflexively, as Joe Cortez reaches 10 in the count, I say, it happened. It happened. And you're right. I'm talking to myself, and I'm talking about what George said in all those conversations leading up to it. And it's the one call that sticks out in my entire broadcasting career as the one most people will remember. People to this day walk up to me on street corners in New York and shopping centers, here on campus at Carolina. People will walk up and say, it happened. It happened. And I think to myself, you have no idea. You really
Yeah,
don't.
it's like it's a double meaning. It meant something to all of us in the rest of the world, but it meant something very personal to you in your own head. But I mean, it's a big. The moments don't get bigger than that. That is Foreman recapturing the title he lost 2 decades earlier to Muhammad Ali, who you originally saw. Yeah.
While wearing the same trunks he had worn in Zaire.
Oh my gosh, I'd forgotten that fact.
He was creating his own destiny.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I guess if he got rope-a-doped on the losing end of a rope-a-dope, then he had to wait and know that he would wear down more and for the moment that he would let him knock him out. He was on the other side of it.
100%. He took a lesson from what had happened to him, and he made it happen to Moore. He allowed Moore to bat him around like a tennis ball for 9 rounds. He allowed Moore to expend a great deal of energy. The attacking fighter is always expending more energy than the guy who's on the other end of his punches. He let Moore wind down his clock. And then he found his moment. It happened.
It's an all-timer. And then he launched the famous Foreman Grill.
Well, he had already launched the Foreman Grill. He was already extraordinarily wealthy before he chose to take the opportunity to become our expert commentator. One thing I say to people that a lot of people find counterintuitive is, he's not just a big grinning, fighter presence. He's a genius. Yeah. He is genuinely a genius. And to anybody who defies that and says, come on, what do you mean he's a genius? Look at the bank account.
Yep.
All you need to know is that bank account is self-constructed. That was not other people offering him opportunities. That was him finding his niche, capitalizing on that smile, capitalizing on his ability to seem like the lesser assuming type person, et cetera, et cetera. He created a persona that could not lose, and he made an incalculable fortune off of it. He's a genius.
I would agree with you. A genius. Well, if we have time, I'd love to hit some of your other famous calls and famous fights. I mean, you were there. This would go back a couple more years before the Foreman fight. I guess it was 90, the same year of Douglas Tyson, but you were there weren't you calling Thunder Meets Lightning? Julio Cesar Chavez knocking out Meldrick Taylor with like 2 seconds left in the final round?
Yeah, and that's not one of my best calls. There are too many words in that call. I'm overhyped, and I'm sort of cluttering the moment with a lot of words. It's not one of my favorites. Another one that people like and can recite some of them is my call of Oscar De La Hoya, Fernando Vargas, as De La Hoya is closing in, and I believe it was the 11th round, getting ready to knock Vargas out, and I'm pointing out what this means in the context of their relationship. If he can shut this kid up, if he can once and for all pay him back for all of the scathing things that Fernando has said about him. It was the right story to tell, but again, there were too many words. I'm self-critical about things like that. But
you're your own worst critic. The rest of us love it. Don't worry.
Yeah, no, I get it. But then, the too many words in Taylor Chavez and too many words in De La Hoya Vargas, but they were both tremendous stories, all the angles of which I wanted to try to get into a capsule comment at the end.
Right. Well, maybe you were still learning. You think you spoke too much in Thunder Meets Lightning, but then you had the Nicholson line saying, "Hey, lay out a little bit and
don't overact." Don't
Yo, don't overact. Yeah,
overact. Yeah. And
exactly.
and
Coming
yes,
from here's Johnny, ironically.
it's always been there for me. Don't
Yeah,
overact.
I love
So
it.
so the times that I did overact a little bit, those are the ones that I kind of regret. But
Yeah,
a lot of viewers, again, have memorized them, can recite them,
yeah.
love them, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah, because we're caught up in the fight too. So yes, you're your own worst critic, but you're one of the best to ever do it. So of course you would be nitpicking your own stuff.
Right.
That's how you
The
get
two
better.
best, unquestionably, and partially because they were in heavyweight championship fights, are Mike Tyson has been knocked out, and it happened. It happened.
Yep.
They're economical.
Absolutely. Well, how about some of the other big heavyweight fights? I remember, didn't you called the big low blow infamous one with Andrew Galata, low blowing Riddick Bowe? Didn't you call that too?
Yes, and wound up leaving ringside to get away from the danger and the havoc of it all, and going up to an elevated camera platform where we had done the opening at the beginning of the evening, because from up there I could see everything that was going on. I could get a panoramic view of how security was failing.
Yeah.
Foreman stayed at ringside and was a sort of individual security guard at ringside. Larry Merchant stayed at ringside, war reporter,
Yeah.
Edward R. Murrow dodging bombs in World War II. That's the way Larry treated that.
Larry.
And then the unforgettable moment is it's probably 25 minutes after the whole thing is broken out. And the producer, Ross Greenberg, says in my ear, okay, I think we're finished with this. Wrap it all up. Move toward getting us off the air. And oh, by the way, if you have some personal summary comment to make about all this, this is the time to get it in. And it wasn't until he said personal summary comment that it dawned on me, and I remembered that my 16-year-old daughter was there in the crowd somewhere.
Oh, wow.
So I suddenly was faced with, oh my God, personal comment, and where in the world is Brooke, and how might this have affected her? And
Wow.
the last thing I said before I signed off was, I got a teenage daughter in here somewhere. I have to go find her. A lot of people
Wow.
remembered that. We
Well,
went down.
viewers can relate to that, man. Wow.
Yeah. Oh, they did. And we left New York the next day and went down to Atlanta, where she was going to spend the entire Atlanta Olympics with me, where I was in the broadcast center as the late night host on NBC, and we would get on the train from the Renaissance Hotel to go downtown to the broadcast center every day. And every day, people on the train would come up and say, "Is this her? Is this the girl?
Hey,
How
she
are
got
you?
out. She
Okay,
made it
et
out.
cetera." She became a momentary TV star.
Wow,
So
that's crazy.
so that wound up, being a happy story
Yeah.
instead of a sad one, but it could have been.
Absolutely. Well, maybe one more big heavyweight fight that at least I remember, or maybe a pair of fights. I remember I guess you called the rematch after Hasim Rahman had knocked out Lennox Lewis, but you called the rematch when Lewis came back with I think it was a 1-2 and knocked out Rahman.
I called both of the Lewis Rockman fights.
Oh, wow. So you saw him get beat too. Saw him get upset too.
Yes.
Wow.
The first one in South Africa.
Yeah.
At about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, by the way, South Africa time. And the thing I'll never forget about Lewis Rockman 1 was that Rockman knocks an exhausted Lewis out in the 7th round. Lennox had made the mistake of going to Johannesburg with its 7,000 feet elevation 5 days before the fight, so that he could stay in Las Vegas and film scenes for Ocean's 11 with Steven Soderbergh getting in the ring against Vladimir Klitschko. He did that because he knew that eventually he might fight Vladimir, and he wanted to get a look at him. He wanted to get into the ring and square off and match up with him to see how he physically fit against Vladimir, who was the first fighter he might have fought in a long time who could conceivably be larger than him.
Like a scouting report.
Right. Exactly. So he took Rockman for granted. He stayed in Vegas to shoot Ocean's 11. He didn't go to a 7,000 foot altitude city until 4 or 5 days before the fight, against the advice of Emmanuel Stewart, who had told him he was making a mistake. And by the seventh round, I mean, your tongue can't hang out when you're wearing a mouth guard. But if the mouth guard hadn't been in, the tongue would have been hanging out. He was that exhausted. And Rahman walked up to him and landed a right hand and ended the fight. The following day, all of us, everybody in both fighter camps, were all on the same flight. I think it was a Lufthansa flight from Johannesburg back to New York. And long flight, 12, 13 hours, Johannesburg to New York. And it was so stunning and expressive about the business, because in first class, you had all of the HBO pay-per-view people, me included, and you had Lennox and Lennox's promoter and Lennox's manager and Emmanuel. They were all up in first class with us. Back in coach, holding the belts, Hasim Rahman and his two managers, Steve Nelson and Robert Middleman. So the glory had been transposed, but it was too early for the shift in seating arrangement to have taken place. We're in first class with the deposed Lennox Lewis. The new champion Rahman is back in coach.
That is such a great story. And Lewis, man, cementing his legacy after that by getting the belt back and beating Tyson too.
Well, the Lewis Tyson thing, a lot of people don't know and don't understand. They trained with each other for 5 or 6 days in upstate New York when they were teenagers. Lewis's coach, Arnie Bem, was friends with Customata, and he brought Lennox down to train with Mike in upstate New York. And they spent 6 days working out together and eventually sparring. And Mike was the one who told me, he said, the first few days, I got the better of him in sparring. I was quicker. I was more assertive. I was mastering him in sparring the first few days. The last few days, he found the range on his jab. He realized more about how to maintain distance. He began to see my punches coming. That got less and less easy for me. And so Mike had a premonition, or at least some advanced knowledge, going into the fight in Memphis, that things might not turn out his way. Remember, he ran across the stage at the first publicity event and dived onto Lennox and bit his leg. He drew blood biting through Lennox's pants leg. And if you thought about it and paid a lot of attention, you might have speculated that Mike was trying to get the fight canceled because of what he already knew about the style matchup against a much taller, longer, bigger man with a jab and a right hand.
He knew he couldn't beat him.
Well, styles make fights, okay? Yep. Styles make fights.
Well, I'm speculating that some people thought he was trying to get out of the promotion. I mean, maybe it was just a crazy day for Mike. I don't know. But the bottom line was he bit him on the leg, and Lennox just was thinking, he's crazy. He's absolutely out of his mind. But I don't think Mike was ever completely crazy. I think he always had a motive and an understanding of where and how he wanted to be. And then the ultimate proof of that was when I went into Mike's dressing room after the fight, and I had not seen him in person for years because he had been with Showtime after leaving HBO, and I had watched his fights on Showtime without seeing him personally. And now, after the conclusion of the Lewis fight, I was asked by HBO producers to go into the dressing room and do an interview with Mike. And I walked in, and it was very touching because the first thing he said to me was, "I've missed you." And I later concluded to myself that wasn't about me personally. When he said, "I've missed you," what he really meant was that he had missed HBO, that he had missed the aura that he was able to project and the atmosphere we had in his first several years on HBO, that he had missed being the recognized heavyweight champion of the world, and that he had missed feeling like he was the best. All of those things, I think, were encompassed in him saying, "I've missed you." And I said, I missed you too. and it was awkward because we're in a dressing room after he's been taken apart and flattened, and the last television image in that fight was a very great HBO cameraman named Gordy Sager leaning over the top rope and shooting straight down at Mike, and you see blood seepage out of both eyes, blood seepage out of both nostrils, blood seepage out of his mouth, because Lennox had touched him up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And sitting there in the dressing room, alone, just the two of us, he looked at me and he said, "What exactly did people expect?" He's always been taller than me. He has longer arms. He has that power. I'm just not really sure what it was people thought I was supposed to be able to do.
Yeah.
Now, he may deny it now. He may say, "Oh, I never said that to Jim," but I remember it very vividly, and I remember that it was touching to me because it was objective reality. There was no more myth at that point. He was no longer Mike Tyson, the indestructible monster. He was a boxer who, like every other boxer, might run up against somebody against whom he doesn't have the right weapons to control the matchup. And he didn't have the right weapons to control the matchup against Lennox.
Absolutely. Yeah. You were there for Buster and you were there for Lennox. And so you got to see sort of the chinks in the armor, or the moments where the indestructible Tyson was finally taken.
Well, but I also saw what the public fell in love with. I saw
the dominant run too.
I saw what was great about him too. I saw him, I saw him knock out guys in less than a minute. I did the Spinks fight, 31 seconds. I saw a number of those kinds of occasions. The very first prize fight I ever called at ABC Sports was Mike Tyson versus Jesse Ferguson. And Ferguson was a journeyman who was in there for the purpose of giving Mike a little bit of a test, but not enough to be dangerous. And in the middle of the fight, fifth or sixth round, Mike exploded Jesse's nose with an uppercut. And there was blood all over the ring. And eventually the referee stopped the fight. And Alex Wallow, later to become a very meaningful executive at Disney and ABC, Alex Wallow went into the ring, my expert commentator, to do the post-fight interview. And he asked Mike about the uppercut that he had landed. And I'd never called a fight before. Here I was beginning my arc in boxing. And Mike said to Alex, "Well, Captain taught me that the purpose of the uppercut is to drive the opponent's nose bone into his brain." And I was trying to drive his nose bone into his brain. And I thought, oh my God, look at what I've happened onto here. Okay, look at what is suddenly in my life. This guy is not only going to be the number one quote machine in boxing, he's going to be the greatest quote machine in sports.
Yeah.
And sure enough, in the next few weeks, they all came pouring out. Boxing is a hurt business. Everybody's got a plan until you hit them. All the things that Cuss had taught him in the gym that he was able to repeat verbatim and turn them into amazingly entertaining quotes. And that was, that was what made Mike the persona that he was. But boxing is real. Boxing is life, and nothing's ever going to be perfect forever. And Lennox Lewis was the antidote to what Mike had.
Absolutely.
As well as, by the way, Evander Holyfield, Ron Borges of the Boston Globe, being the only person in a 50-plus person media pool who properly picked the first Tyson versus Holyfield fight. Everybody picked Mike to win that fight in the media pool, and Borges picked Holyfield. And I remember thinking, what is he smoking? That doesn't seem possible. But if you watched it, then you saw it. It was a style fight. It was a style fight that would always be the same. Mike was an attacker. Attackers are eventually going to run into the counterpuncher who has the right medicine. And Evander was a natural-born counterpuncher with a spectacular counter left hook. He was exactly what Mike had trouble dealing with. And nobody really, other than Borges, foresaw it before that first fight.
Wow. That's such good insight. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you've been there for so many great boxing fights. There's so many boxing we could do. We could do, I think you were there when Manny Pacquiao got knocked out in 2012, Juan Manuel Marquez in their fourth fight, and Roy Jones Jr. saying he's not getting up, Jim. Like your name, Jim, or even the late Harold Letterman, rest in peace, saying, okay, Jim, going to the scorecards. All your name, the Jim, is in so many of these iconic boxing moments. But
in the Marquez Pacquiao knockout, you will recall that there was an instantaneous sense. A lot of people in the arena, including my wife, their first response was, he's dead. That Marquez had literally killed him with the punch because Manny was so still,
he's out.
so totally inert after that punch. Fortunately, of course, that wasn't the case. But again, Manny Pacquiao, the nonstop attacker, Juan Manuel Marquez, the consummate counterpuncher. Same thing. Same style confrontation.
Yeah, crazy. Well, you've done so much. You NASCAR Firecracker 400 with President Reagan and Richard Petty. I mean, the list goes on and on. But
I met 7 presidents in a row, all of the last 7.
That's incredible.
So, yeah.
The people you've met, the folks you've interviewed, it is an incredible career, an incredible legacy that continues live on ppv.com Saturday, September 30th in Vegas for Alvarez, Charlo. Everyone check it out on the 30th. Hey, thank you so much for taking so much time with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's my privilege. I'm sorry I'm long-winded. Thanks very much for the questions.
You're good to go. I could have talked all day.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. Our theme music is Scott Buckley's Clarion. Remember to give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. We'll see you next time.